Okay, now we're live. This is the Regulations of Libertarians. This is my two guests is Pragmatic Culture, who's been on my channel before, and
Hello.
newer guest is Geo-Libertarian George.
Hi.
So we're just gonna talk about how we can just right now the libertarian movement or the ideology is very divisive and diverse. Right now, I just figured I won't have a strain just bringing bringing the extremes together, having like a reconciliation, so to speak. Myself is rather more hard right. Geo-Libertarian George is in the center, and Pragmatic is also a more hard right libertarian in a sense.
Okay. So I'll do the best I can in what appears to be quite a matchup here. But I mean, I feel like, so are we sort of opening the floor now to what needs to be done, or?
Yeah, what must be done.
Well, I think that personally, and maybe Pragmatic Culture, we'll see what he has to say. I think the first thing that we need to do is, and correct me if you don't have this understanding, but I feel like that there's quite some entrenchment, as you were alluding to, among the various sort of, or among people who follow various sorts of schools of thought within libertarianism. And I think that one of the problems is, I mean, see, it's a very principled, the sort of breadth of libertarian thought, I feel like it falls into a general sort of philosophical sphere that's quite principled in its approach. And I mean, there are obviously more utilitarian sort of libertarians as well. But I would say most of us sort of come at things from a very principled approach. And I think that because this is something that we largely kind of pride ourselves on, and I think for good reason. But what it leads to, I feel like, is because principles can be interpreted differently, we sort of get into this sort of spiral of purity testing a bit, and the sort of mode of thought that, well, my particular school of libertarianism is the real libertarianism and yours isn't, so therefore there's no reason for me to even be talking to you because there's nothing of value I can get from you at all. Or there's no reason for us to even like try to collaborate on particular topics that that are of mutual interest to all libertarians. And I think we would be able to arrive at that point on most topics. I mean, we can probably see some of this in the Twitter sphere to begin with, but we also see this I feel like, at the very sort of top of the libertarian movement at an institutional level. I mean, there's been this divide between sort of the more, like, let's say, paleo-libertarian Mises Institute, like Murray Rothbard, Lou Rockwell type of camp, and let's say the more classically liberal
Jeffrey Tucker
sort
types.
of Friedman-esque types that you would see at Cato or Reason or other sort of spheres. I would say also large deal of academic or libertarian academia. Somebody like Michael Munger, if you will, although he's, I think, someone who is potentially quite a bridge builder, both because he's brilliant and also because he's just an incredible personality. But I think that the first step for us is to really sort of tone it down a little bit in the way that we're approaching each other. And I mean, finding some way, ultimately, we're probably not going to end up agreeing on everything, but if we want the libertarian movement to go forward, I feel like we're going to have to come to an agreement on some type of platform that gets us what we all want on the majority of things, and that makes us, let's say, happy enough on the rest. Because I feel like that we've got to be thinking about. I mean, you brought up earlier this point about, okay, well, we're right libertarians, I'm more of a centrist, and there are left libertarians. But I feel like we're getting to the point in politics now when we're going to have to be thinking about politics ultimately being a divide between sort of libertarian thought and authoritarian thought, or authoritarian collectivist thought. And I feel like that's really where the differentiation is going to come down, and that we've maybe got to be thinking like that and start preparing for that. All of us who are interested in the primacy of individual liberty. So I'll stop now. I've been rambling a bit.
No, I think that was a good summation of kind of the situation that we're dealing with right now. One phrase that comes to mind when I think of all this is the perfect being the enemy of the good. And I think we all, in our very principled and very varied intellectual different ways, we all have our own goals of what would be the perfect libertarian society, be it more minarchist or ANCAP or something like that. But at the end of the day, there are very few of us, because of those principles, who are willing to make any compromise whatsoever. And that becomes a problem for some of us who are just willing to take a good enough at the moment, in the hope and knowledge that good enough will lead to better conditions down the line. And so I think the big deal right now is, not to worry about purity spiraling so much as tends to happen about who's, the purest libertarian, who's not, but also what is the most realistic way to achieve our goals, and does it stay consistent with what we want still?
Yeah, and I would add to that, what we can achieve that's realistic, but that also has, let's say, a credibly libertarian base of principle behind it. I mean, there's going to be some disagreement over this, but I feel like that it would be in our interest to sort of find something that we're at the very least generally comfortable with, even if, like, some of us, or maybe even all of us, may have some type of bone to pick, if you will.
Interesting. Just I guess right now, just I just like, we're like the fringes and the minority. I just want to just lessen the infighting among libertarians, whether they're statists or leftists or center. But we all have one goal: to limit the size of the state, the Leviathan state, if you will. That should be the ultimate goal. We got rather subtle differences here and there, but at least if your goal is to limit the size of the government, or radically reform the government, I think that should be the ultimate end goal.
Right. And I think it's worth sort of having a discussion of the parameters of, let's say, what really defines size of government. Because I feel like, well, this is something where maybe there would be some disagreement, a source of disagreement between those who come at things from maybe a more classical liberal perspective that's informed to a large degree by, somebody like Friedman or Hayek, and some of the others who would be, let's say, like strict minarchists. I mean, I think, and also we should prioritize sort of, what about government is really causing the most damage, is really sort of an act of, let's say, engineering society rather than society sort of organically develop. Like things like this. I mean, I could come up with maybe some other ideas on this at the moment. Maybe some will pop up in the course of this conversation, but I think that that's if we're going to be, let's say, serious strategically about this, I think that at the very least that's an important question to ask and sort of define in terms of before we start thinking about the platform that we're going to build together.
Definitely. And to pick up kind of on your last point there, I would say that prioritizing certain parts of government that are doing the most damage is essential, because I think one of the things that does libertarianism as a movement the most harm is this tendency to classify all government expansion as equal, and the reduction of all government as the same as well, because as much as we don't like it, government has a monopoly on certain services right now that we still need. And so if we were to say, disband the police, as I know a lot of libertarians would want, that would certainly be a reduction in government size, but it really wouldn't be effective to our ends of achieving greater liberty, because we still need some sort of security force, and God knows how long it would take for, say, a private security force to arise in like the wake of the disbandment of the police and things like that. Or if like the army were to dissipate as well, which I know is something a lot of libertarians kind of push for. So there are good measures, same with like border control too. Like, we need it at the moment, because at this point in time, if you don't have borders, then, you leave yourself open as a nation to just mass invasion. And so there are some things that we have to say, well, these things for the time being are necessary functions of government, but that doesn't mean we can't shrink more other functions and affect functions that arguably affect you much more, like something like the military budget expanding or increased border patrol and a wall really doesn't do much to limit your freedom personally or as an individual. It's not generally affecting you. But like something like the expansion of the welfare state, which directly leads to much higher taxes, or something like the war on drugs, these are issues which affect far more individuals and have a greater impact on their freedom. So rather than focusing on sort of these niche things and treating all government the same, we should prioritize and kind of compartmentalize some various functions of government and say, all right, well, these are doing the most harm to individual freedom, so we should get rid of these, and then focus on some of the more, less harmful stuff down the line, like border security and the army.
Well, if we're going to focus is the most intrusive from the government, I guess the intelligent state apparatus is definitely the most intrusive and the most violation of liberty, what we can call liberties from a libertarian standpoint.
Yeah, and just to build on that for a second, I mean, I think that what pragmatic culture just brought up, I mean, I think that we also need to extend this to the realm of, well, the one topic that I don't think most libertarians like to talk about, and that's taxation. Because I mean, if we're going to maintain government, I mean, we're going to have some form of taxation around, and I think that well, okay, I lost my train of thought there. But anyways, so because that's just necessarily true. I think that we need to sort out how we're going to deal with this topic. I think that we need, because for one, not all types of taxes are the same. I think that, you know, just as there tends to be this sort of idea among libertarians that pragmatic culture just referred to, that sort of all government is seen as being the same, and all reductions in government sort of having the same impact on society. I mean, the same is true about taxation. So I think we need to have a discussion about, okay, well, if we're going to have a tax system to fund the government, what type of tax system should we have? And, you know, is there maybe even a tax system that, from a certain point of view, actually is compatible with libertarian principle? I mean, I think that, you know, there's this sort of idea that, and I mean, maybe I'm sort of pulling the discussion a little bit more in the direction of my sort of school of thought, but there's this sort of view that's popular among libertarians that taxation is theft. And I think that most of us would agree that certainly that most forms of taxation and that the way that our current tax system is structured definitely constitutes a form of theft. But then it's perhaps worth discussing, well, are there some forms of taxes that maybe from some point of view wouldn't be necessarily considered theft of private property, or that maybe could be a way of sort of upholding individual rights, enforcing individual rights in the market? I think that that's also a discussion we're going to have to end up having if we're going forward with a realistic plan about discussing the topic of government, and perhaps are building a platform going forward that we can build a political movement on that could end up affecting policy someday.
Well, for taxes, libertarians on the more on the conservative bench will argue for a flat tax or sales tax, because sales tax is considered to be more voluntary for libertarian standards.
I also think, I mean, if we're talking about certain taxes being better than others, I think there's better ways to conduct them. I think the Libertarian Party doesn't necessarily, or libertarians in general, don't do themselves any favors by constantly pushing the taxation is theft line. Not that I think it's wrong, but just that even most conservatives, if they kind of concede it, will say it's a useless talking point because they still buy into the line, oh, this is what's necessary for civilization, so forth and so on. And I think, you know, because that's kind of the normie political view, we ought to work in that frame, like, all right, well, let's just have the best system possible, like you were suggesting before, Geo-Libertarian. And I think what Voltaire said too, a flat tax would probably be the most amenable form of taxation, or if not a flat tax, maybe instead of an income tax at all, just a sales tax, something like that.
Yeah. Well, I guess, could I, well, go ahead. Let's let Soul-Drift 7 speak, actually. You haven't had a chance to speak.
Well, as a conservative, I feel almost the same way, but since we're talking about taxes, one thing I always like to mention is corporate tax. And in every state, there's a corporate tax. And you look at the state of Texas, their corporate tax is like literally nothing, isn't it? And look how prosperous they are.
Well, yeah, I think eliminating some taxes altogether wouldn't be a horrible idea too, but, you know, in falling short of like the beautiful ANCAP utopia some of us want, I think there are...
well, except me. Not me. I'm a conservative.
Yeah, except you. I mean, I think there are still some better ways of taxing, like we were talking about before, like just a sales tax as opposed to any other form of tax, or maybe a flat income tax like Rand Paul was pushing before, and things like that.
Okay. Could I maybe have an opportunity to put forth sort of my ideas on this?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Are you familiar with the school of geo-libertarianism at all?
That's Georgist, right?
Yeah, it's George's, exactly.
I'm only vaguely familiar with it because when I read Power and Market, there's a bit of a section in there Rothbard dedicates to the Georgist school, but I'm happy to hear more
Oh
about
boy.
it.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, Rothbard made some arguments that, well, I don't find to be very good. But anyhow, so like basically the idea behind Georgism, it has its roots in the way that, let's say, the earliest classical liberals thought about property. And I mean, in particular, you can go back to the Second Treatise of Government by John Locke to sort of see the source of this. Whereas in the Second Treatise, John Locke, he defines the origin of private property as beginning with, let's say, the application of labor, and the argument is extended to capital as well. The application of labor and capital to natural resources and transforming it into material wealth. Whereas he specifies beforehand that the sort of natural domain, land, natural resources, the natural space, is properly interpreted as common property because no one created it at all. We all need access to it in order to survive, in order to create wealth, and so on and so forth. And he sort of tops off the specification with the Lockean proviso, where he states that sort of after people have appropriated natural resources and are creating wealth with it or excluding it in some way, there must be enough left over and of all qualities for everyone else to be able to access in order to create wealth or to enjoy the returns that come from accessing resources. So, from this sort of moral standpoint, what Georges and other classical liberals argued for was, or what they argued is that a tax on labor, and a tax on capital, a tax on exchange and trade can be properly seen as theft of private property, essentially, within this framework. And it's a penalizing of productive effort, fundamentally. But at the same time, what they supported instead, and what they concluded was ultimately the best way to tax, is to tax land value, based on the idea that land should properly be viewed as more as common property. And they also made the argument, many arguments on the grounds of economic efficiency for a land value tax. Because since land is a perfectly inelastic good with no marginal cost of production, a tax on land rent for a single plot of land, or the land price for a single plot of land that captures land rent, ultimately causes no deadweight loss in the market, because it doesn't change any incentives of the landowner with respect to how much land they're going to offer. And because land is inelastic, the value of land is perfectly driven by demand itself. So that ultimately all you're capturing is a sort of landlord surplus from rent. And this would also have a very positive growth effect, because now there's a lot of idle land that's that's not being used. It's being excluded largely for speculative purposes. That could be opened up for investment by private investors and entrepreneurs in productive activity. It would be something that would increase demand for labor and increase wages as such. and also it would correct the problem that we tend to see of speculative land values, sort of land speculation and driving land prices up, particularly when you consider the effect that discretionary monetary policy tends to have on this. And ultimately, this ends up closing off more and more land from productive use, driving asset bubbles that eventually burst in the form of what we saw around 2007 to 2008. So if I were going to, I would quite strenuously argue that going with this approach, a land value tax approach, would be probably the best way that we could satisfy everyone in terms of in terms of both libertarian principle, since there is a sort of argument from this that I think emerges from a school of thought that was very important to the development of libertarianism. And one that lifts the burden from, I think we would all agree to be the possessors of, the legitimate possessors of private property, being workers and investors and entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. And it's also something I would argue for very strongly on utilitarian grounds. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, maybe.
Well, I understand where you're coming from in that land is a different kind of property that doesn't necessarily require the mingling of labor. I would be hesitant to use the term common property simply because when we think of commons and, as in common parlance with the state right now, common property is often that property which is said to belong to everyone. There is this collective ownership of it. We see quite aptly what Plato described as the tragedy of the commons. And so rather than that land being effectively used by someone who eventually comes to pick it up, or, well, everyone is kept from picking it up, and so the land never gets put to good use. And what I would say about the speculation of land is, I don't think it's right to conflate the bubble that was created by the 2008 housing crisis with necessarily land speculation. I think that was specifically the housing industry and not necessarily land, although the two aren't totally separate. And I think because land speculation is still necessary, because just like any other commodity or any other resource, there's a time for it to be used, and there's someone who knows how to use it properly. And so if you don't allow the bidding up and down of land prices to see who can best utilize it, then you allow that land to fall into the wrong hands. Because like anything else, property has a price because price is a market signal. And the value of that property will effectively signal to someone out there, some business, that you could use this land for a good purpose at the price it's at now, or no, this land is too expensive, or it's too cheap, meaning it's obviously not good land, something like that. And so I think rather than common property, I think a better term for it would be unclaimed property, because it's just a matter of time until someone actually homesteads it or does something with it till they claim it. And just leaving it as common property or taxing it into making the use of the land so untenable that production on new land would become nearly impossible, I don't think is a good idea.
Well,
does that make sense?
I could let me respond to some of those points. I mean, in terms of the common property thing, like, I think that, the question needs to be asked, and, maybe this isn't the time to have the philosophical discussion on it. The question needs to be asked, okay, well, is mere sort of discovery of land or mere purchasing of land, well, let's say mere homesteading discovery of land, is that enough to ethically claim private property rights over something. And I don't think that discovery in general is really the foundation of that, of private property.
Well, I think the act of homesteading would be a bit different than discovery. You're right. I would agree with you. Discovery in itself wouldn't be enough, but I think the act of homesteading, as in, not just setting up a fence around a plot of land, but actually, working the land and transforming it in some appreciable way, be it extracting resources from it or actually building something on it, something like that, I think would be a more legitimate way of claiming land.
Well, but I think that in terms of, I mean, when you talk about improving land, I mean, I don't want to tax, we wouldn't be taxing the value of the improvements at all. I mean, that's, I want to go ahead and stipulate that. I mean, what we would be trying to do is tax, let's say, the value of a real estate property that represents a sort of unimproved value in a sense. And I mean, even when you, so like when you homestead and you apply labor to land and make investments in buildings, which I wouldn't want to tax, I mean, you're still excluding a certain amount of value in the land that you're not really utilizing, if that makes sense. And so it still represents, I think, a natural opportunity that isn't really sort of being exploited. So, okay, some other points, 'cause there was a lot there. I mean, in terms of like using markets to distribute land, I agree. I mean, I'm not calling for nationalization of land. Let's make that clear. I mean, when I use the term common property, I mean, if you tax something, you're effectively sort of establishing it as that. So, whereas now, I mean, through income taxation, we've established common property effectively to everything, and I think that we definitely want to move away from that. But I mean, when it comes to markets, I mean, speculation in land, the problem with that is that speculation feeds speculation. And you tend to see these sort of spirals in speculation that ultimately will end up precluding land from being put to, let's say, best productive use. The other thing I would say there is that in land markets, I mean, the price of land or the acquisition price of land doesn't always necessarily correspond with who is going to put the land to best use, especially since speculation is one of the things that tends to drive land prices. Also, I mean, it's what puts the land to best use. I agree that the market is the way to sort of is the way to determine this ultimately. But I don't think that speculation is really what we're going for here. I think what we want to see is a market in which land is distributed among people who are going to use it productively, and with sort of disincentives for speculative investment. I think that would be sort of a more organic way of distributing land meritocratically, or let's say a more direct way of distributing it meritocratically. And I mean, the trouble also with land value is, and oh God, I may be about to sort of piss some people off. You're going to think that I might be kind of leftist here. But the other problem with land values over time is that as economies grow, and in particular as technology advances, as opportunities for trade are opened, particularly as international trade develops and you have lots of new commercial opportunities available, you tend to see the demand for land in places where people concentrate escalate to a very high degree. And it's something that ultimately will end up start pushing people to the margins. It's something that ultimately ends up massively just sort of skewing the distribution of wealth to a degree that it ends up eating into the returns that people who are engaging in productive activity, or who could engage in productive activity, are going to start losing out in the share of wealth distribution. And that's not a particularly healthy thing for an economy. I would also say, argue, and this sort of goes back to the question of property rights and sort of justice of exclusion of natural opportunity. When land values go up, so basically, like a landowner, when they do things on their land and they're creating value, the value that they're creating isn't really in, let's say, the raw, unimproved land value itself. It's really when communities start to develop around particular plots of land, where economies are developing and people are earning incomes and creating wealth. It's when that happens that land values tend to go up. So, I mean, there's a real argument, I feel like, that when landowners are sort of earning rents, when they're earning returns to land that aren't related to any investments of their labor or capital, that they're ultimately earning returns that they didn't really create, and that are accumulating only because of their exclusion of a natural opportunity. That can be argued from, let's say, a Lockean perspective to be a violation of other people's rights. So I feel like that there is a sort of argument for appropriating land rents and distributing them to whatever we feel like that the government needs to do. And also, whenever governments spend money on services, these ultimately end up being captured in land values, whether the government invests in a road or even in something like law enforcement that keeps a community stable, and that makes it an attractive place to do commerce and so on and so forth. Am I making any sense, or?
No, I've gotten the gist of what you said. I think there's a larger discussion to be had here about the libertarian principles, because I think there has to be a discussion about the separation of speculation from the market process, which I don't necessarily think is right, because I would say speculation is a valid part of the market process, and also possibly, the economic ramifications of what government does, how the prices of a lot of other goods are caught up in land values, which is a valid case. But I think this discussion is somewhat to try to bring it back to what we were originally talking about. This discussion, I think, would be lost on the general public, because they don't even have the fundamental underlying assumptions that we do, be it sort of the Lockean classical liberalism or anything like that. And so I would wonder how such a message. Oh, well, first off, those were the principles the country was founded off, and so I would wonder how we A, lost those principles, and B, how we would go about bringing them back.
Well,
wait, can I just clarify one thing?
Sure.
I want to clarify, I'm not against all speculation at all. I'm not talking about like ending the stock market or anything. I'm actually I'm doing a PhD right now in financial economics. I'm very much hoping to sort of have a career in speculation, if you will. So I'm not like, anti-market leftist or anything here.
No, of course.
But like, I mean, in the particular case of land, there's a real issue there. And I think that if you take the sort of framework that I'm working upon, how I'm viewing property, there is something that would be quite problematic. I mean, do you see how like I would see that from that perspective?
Oh no, definitely. I can see your point of view. I would disagree with it in this sense, but I mean, how would I'd be happy if more people saw it in your view, even though it's not perfectly mine. I mean, because at least we still have that frame set of what property is, how you go about it, and what is and isn't a violation of property rights. I'm still trying to worry about how we bring back that conception first before maybe we get to our discussion. Although I hope we can get to it in some sort of larger public setting down the line, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I would also argue, I mean, let's see, can we all agree that we all fucking hate the income tax?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I do think that if we think, and sorry, I just want to make one comment because I had a light bulb go off, and maybe we can get back to the question you brought up earlier. But I do think that there is a sort of very populist type of message that we could build around a tax reform program that eliminates the income tax. And I really think that we shouldn't shy away. Like, in some ways, we're going to have to maybe be a bit more pragmatic in the ideas we're putting forth. But I don't think that we should shy away from something as, let's say, as radical as discussing getting rid of the income tax.
No, I'm with you there. I think we can definitely, I think we can build a more successful Tea Party movement without it ending up like the Tea Party movement because, they were bought out and stuff. But I think you can form a populist message around, hey, why the hell did the government get involved with taking your money directly out of your pocket anyway?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure.
Sorry, go on, Soul.
Well, I was going to say, we have to take into account that there are 3 types of taxes, probably even more. There's federal tax, state tax, and local tax. Now, the question about earlier when you two guys were talking about property, should that be more of a federal thing or a state thing? Like, should the state have the authority over that sort of thing, or should it be federal or local about buying land and land taxation?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think one thing that land value taxation could be compatible of is the idea of sort of defederalizing some, if you will.
So have the state. So let the state be in control.
Well, I mean, I think that primarily, like, you would want to end up at that point. I would be in favor of obviously replacing the federal system with the land value tax system. But I mean, the thing is, you're going to have local communities that I think there's a real argument for doing it at that, a particularly strong argument for doing it at that level, since you have sort of population clustering and wealth creation in cities leading to quite high land rents. And if they're able to recapture that value locally and spend on services that are directly going to benefit their populations rather than sort of relying on the federal government. I mean, if we could sort of get to that point, I think that would be a place that would be pretty satisfying for a lot of us, if it meant ultimately reducing the size and scope of the federal government.
Of course. I mean, I think every government, federal, state, local, should have their own job to do. That way, you don't put everything on just one form of government.
Not only that, but moving the locus of control closer to the people, I think, is a good idea too. Because I mean, I think I like the idea of having each level of government responsible for their own little bit, which is ostensibly what they're supposed to do. But of course, there's a lot of overlapping responsibilities between the state and the county, the federal government and the state level, things like that. But I think moving the locus of control closer to the people who are actually paying the taxes, so like, you know, giving the states more powers, giving the counties more power, something like that would be a strong libertarian kind of populist message we could also get behind potentially.
Well, as a conservative, I do somewhat agree. I've even had to argue that, well, if let's say the federal tax was just like 8%, and you had, like, let's say your coastal left-wing progressives in California or somewhere like that arguing, saying that's not enough, and we can just say, well, okay, what about your state tax? What about your governor? Why don't you advocate raise your state taxes and see how it just works in your state alone?
Yeah, I mean, like, if California, for example, if they went with the land value tax system, they wouldn't need anything from the federal government ever. I mean, they might even be able to function as their own country, if you will. Because, I mean, land in California is insane.
Over my dead body, they will not.
Okay, regressing back to what you guys said, that how can we attain the same values that the same values the country have since its founding. I was about to say that we ultimately cannot achieve the same values again. I think we just need to keep moving forward, you know?
I agree. It's kind of like Evola wrote that tradition is dead and you got to build something from the ruins and so forth and so on. But I think the question is, you know, we want to build something that's somewhat similar to the ruins, if only slightly, because, you know, that's what got us here in the first place. So we're trying to, you know, move forward and bring that bit of the past that got us to this point with us. So I think that's the challenge too.
Are you talking about?
Well, sorry, go for it.
No, you go. You go first.
Well, I think that we need to somehow connect this to the future too, because we're looking to the future. And I mean, the thing about these sort of the values, that the classical liberal values that inspired the founding fathers, that inspire our foundation. The thing about it is, I mean, these are very forward-looking values. The idea of individual freedom, to pursue your own well-being, to pursue your happiness, to pursue your dreams, to make the best of yourself, to make your future better. I mean, that's really what it was all about from the very beginning.
Excuse me, if I hope I'm not interrupting, but are you talking about are you talking about like the revolution?
Yeah, I mean, they wanted they wanted a future of freedom. They wanted the ability to, you know, the idea of individual freedom is that you have the ability to determine your path, your future for yourself. And I mean, that's exactly what the founders wanted. That's what we all wanted at that time when we rebelled against King George.
Yeah. Well, okay, go ahead.
No, go for it. Sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say when Bergman had said something about tradition is dead and the ruins. I don't know what he meant by that, because I think, like, you know, if he was talking about like the crown tradition, yeah, that was dead in America, because America by then formed its own tradition, because America was made up of different kind of people by then. So I think, like, yeah, there was tradition, but there was also like you said, pursuit of dreams, or as it says in the Constitution, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right to private property, and that sort of thing. Declaration of Independence.
Well, what I think Evola was evoking more so when he wrote, or when he, to broadly summarize what he said, when he was kind of saying tradition was dead, it wasn't more so that the ideas of singular systems and those sort of traditions of governance were dead, but more so that the notion of tradition in a broader sense was dead. Because, I mean, liberty and the Lockean sort of classical liberal notions that formed Europe was its tradition. And I think when he was writing, because he was a writer, he was a contemporary of a lot of different mid 20th century writers who traditionalist, fascist writers kind of things. But one of the things he wrote was that that tradition that built Europe, that allowed for the thriving of individual liberty, is kind of, it's just not present anymore, and it's kind of been replaced. And so one of the things I think I'm kind of taking from what he wrote is that those traditions of even the classical liberals might be dead, but we can still take what they gave us, what we learned from them, and bring it into a newer, more future-looking type of governance, that sort of thing, if that makes any sense.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Edmund Burke said something similar.
Yeah, definitely. But again, I would also add, just the principle of individual freedom itself is, I mean, it is something that I think has an inherent connection to being forward-looking, and about sort of valuing everyone's domain over their being able to pursue their dreams and to and to make their future the best that they can for themselves and for the people they love, and so on and so forth. And I think that it's something that just at the absolute highest level, I think it fairly easily connects with people. I mean, if you're not talking about policy or anything like that, or philosophy or legal structures and so on, I mean, if you're just talking about certain fundamentals of being a human being and what really sort of drives people, it's something that really instantly reaches people, I feel like. I mean, everybody wants to be able to set their own path in life, I feel like.
Unless you're Adolf Hitler or Mao Zedong.
Well, they wanted to set other people's path in life.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant.
Well,
I wasn't like that wasn't an attack or anything. That was just like, except except for those, like, well, not just them, but like Antifa, the white nationalists, like just the crazy people. This is call them the crazy people.
yeah, okay. I mean, but we're going to be dealing with crazy people forever.
I know. And the question is when is the right move? What kind of craziness is this? What kind of crazy move are they going to make? And that forward.
Well, I don't know. Well, it's something unrelated, but when Soldier 7 mentioned Sherman Mao and Adolf Hitler, it reminded me of this quote by Thomas Sowell. These leaders did not have tragic vision of man, such as underlying what is called a conservative thought in America today. It was precisely the dictators' presumption of their own vastly greater knowledge of wisdom than ordinary people, which led to staggering tragedies for others. Yeah.
Yes. And as Edmund Burke also said, in order for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. With crazy people, like, on some level, you need to have them around because, I mean, you need to know what a crazy person is, and you need to be aware that there's a presence of their ideas.
Well, I mean, like I think there's good crazy and there's bad crazy.
Yeah. Well,
Like-
and I mean, also crazy can be really entertaining.
Like bad crazy is like, you know, like I said, tyrants and terrorists and
Yeah.
serial killers, that sort of thing. Good crazy is more like being willing to do dangerous things in order to like stop bad things from happening. Like, you know, like the guy who probably, and I'm not just talking about like, you know, General Patton type crazy who, yeah, won the war, helped win the war and everything. But like maybe a guy who's willing to run out in the middle of a tornado, risk getting blown away to save a child or something like that. Yeah, that kind of crazy. Good crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's really about stopping the rise of bad crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like in that what's that movie? I don't really want to talk about it because I'm not a fan of him anymore because of what I heard he was accused of doing. You ever seen that movie Demolition Man?
That's Sylvester Stallone
Yes, Sylvester Stallone.
and Wesley Snipes.
Yeah, do you remember that scene? Do you remember that scene where Sylvester Stallone's character says, "You send a maniac to catch one"?
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Oh, okay. Well, in the scene, he says, "Well, because you know he plays a cop, Stallone's character, and Wesley Snipes, he plays like the radical. He's like a radical terrorist or warlord. I don't know what he is. He's just a criminal. But like, yeah, he says like Stallone's character, who's the cop, he says, "You send a maniac to catch one," because like Stallone, like he's like known as this special cop. He does all this dangerous stuff to like stop dangerous guys like him. So it's like good crazy and bad crazy. You send a maniac to catch one.
Yeah.
Do you think the alt-right is good crazy or bad crazy?
I don't really know, to be honest with you. I feel like the problem with the alt-right is that they let the roaches come in and they didn't try to exterminate them. Like I just think they got roaches crawling over the alt-right, and that's the problem. Because I don't think the alt-right as a whole is racist or white nationalist, but I think that when they let these when I said, but when you kind of associate with people like that or like feel sympathetic towards people like that, it's gonna like, yeah, you're gonna let the roaches in and they're gonna fest everywhere.
Well, I mean, how would you define the alt-right then? Because my understanding of the alt-right is that it's based most generally on white identitarianism, but that it's also, I would say, predominantly based on white ethno-nationalism as well. And
Well,
the people who, like you're talking about, who really like don't ascribe to those views, my understanding is like they're basically considered alt-light, I guess, like people like Milo or
Gavin McGinnis.
yeah.
Well, I suppose so. I mean, I don't, because if that's the case, then if all right is just all white nationalists and white ethnicity, then my question is why you call yourselves alt right? Shouldn't it be alt left? Because you're basically just advocating the same amount of collectivism as the as a left. Yeah, you have a different vision, but you're advocating the amount of collectivism, and that's kind of why I don't believe in the right-wing authoritarian and the right-wing libertarian or left-wing authoritarian, left-wing libertarian. I don't believe in that cube. I believe in like, you know, left-wing, right-wing, far left, far right. As far as I'm concerned, if that's what the alt-right is, like white nationalists, white ethnicity, all about interest in whiteism or whatever, then yeah, they should be on the left because they pretty much just advocate collectivism.
I think I'll just chime in briefly here. I think the collectivist individualist dichotomy is one that's fairly overused, and if I'm being honest, not entirely accurate, because, I mean, how do you define an individual? If you're an individual and you say, "Oh, well, I'm a Christian," well, what is Christianity but a larger religion, or a group of people, or a collective, you might say? If you say, "I'm white," well, you're defining yourself by a collective again, because whites are a group of people. Or even if you continue in that fashion, of an individual is done by identifying with other collectives, and the collective is made up of those certain individuals, but still, and is defined by them. And so the two are intermingled in such a way where trying to divide the two isn't, I think, a politically useful tactic. And I think this is something else libertarians are kind of too keen on doing, is one sort of mindset that everything is either individualist or collectivist, and that there is no in between. And I kind of think that's a bad one to have, because I think, there are things like natural collectives and not only natural collectives, but voluntary collectives. And, those things kind of blur the line. Well, I'm choosing to be a part of this group and this collective as an individual. So it's still a collective. So you could still call it collectivism, but it's my individual choice to do so. So is it still collectivist? Is it individualist? The lines get blurred. And so I don't think going down that line is a good strategy. And on a larger note about the alt-right, I think the alt-right, there was Reason did a really cringy video a while ago about the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. And I think there's something there a little bit that we can take advantage of in the alt-right, almost, because Jeff Deist, president of the Mises Institute, made this speech a little while ago. He said, if libertarians abandon the notion of blood and soil, then we're going to get politically left behind. And so I think what we could do is, rather than just dismissing the alt-right one way or the other, what we'd be better off doing is kind of using them and co-opting them and kind of fixing their more, broadly defined authoritarian tendencies, and trying to bring them back to a more free market approach, because I think those tendencies are there in them. I think, the debate over markets isn't one that the alt-right is settled on, because there are people in the alt-right who would certainly be more left-wing than right-wing, but at the same time, there are plenty of paleo-libertarians and paleo-conservatives in the vein of Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell and Pat Buchanan, who inhabit the alt-right as well. And so I think what we're better off doing as libertarians is kind of talking to them and kind of trying to fix them, as opposed to just dismissing them outright.
Well, but I don't think that those guys who you just listed are necessarily like alt-right. I don't think that they're like ethno-nationalist or anything like that. A couple of points, like on the notion of individualism versus collectivism. I mean, I think that we need to sort of define the parameters here, because like I agree certainly with the notion of voluntary collectives, if you will, but a voluntary collective isn't something that really violates individual rights, because you have a right to freedom of association. And a part of that freedom of association is your freedom to disassociate as well. So like I don't think that's the real issue. I think like the issue with collectivism is or the kind of collectivism that a lot of people have a problem with is this sort of collectivism that aims to engineer a sort of society that's based on sort of the interests of the collective over the interests of the individual, specifically in ways that violate individual rights.
Okay,
and I think that maybe the terminology isn't the best thing to do, and maybe it's not the best sort of topic to get hung up on. I mean, as a Georgist, I actually think that the topic could be discussed a bit more complementary from my philosophical point of view. But I think that we sort of do need to be clear about what we mean. Like, for example, when we discuss it internally, Because I mean, I see your point there for sure.
Hmm.
I
Well,
think
I think
when-
even the term socially engineer is a bit broad, if only because Catholics and Christians and various sort of and Hindus and Jews and whoever all try to engineer society so that they can bring about their values in society. But I don't think they do it in ways that necessarily, like you said, violate individual rights. So I think that's another distinction that ought to be made as well.
Yeah, so let's say like centrally planned, if you will.
Yeah, that's kind of, I think that's a good way of distinguishing it.
Yeah.
I like to move on from the topic of how can libertarians can fight the state. Has anyone heard of Charles Murray, the author of The Bell Curve and Losing Ground?
Sounds familiar.
Okay, he wrote a book not so while ago called By the Liberty or Retaking Liberty. And I did have the book for a while and watched his lecture about it. And he admitted that the Constitution is dead, but his main problem with the Leviathan state is the regulatory state, the regulations, and his solution is the Madison Fund, i.e., the founding father Jay Madison, to basically fight the regulatory state. Does anyone else have any idea? His basically is civil disobedience in a legal sense. Does any of you guys have any idea to fight the state in different ways?
Depends on the situation, I guess. like if you like you have to give me an issue. Like guns?
Well, like let's say you run a business. Let's say you run a business and
Okay.
and you don't hire natives. You hire the immigrants. And let's say there's a regulation saying you need to hire natives. So unless you don't do that, your business is shut down. And what Charles Murray is proposing is a legal firm to fight the regulatory state to all they got till they give up. So yeah.
Well, as long as they're legal and they got green cards, I don't see the problem with hiring them.
Well, I think the larger point is the effective methods of fighting the state, be they using the state apparatus itself or being outside the state apparatus. And I think there's a case for both, because I think all action to change the state has to start from outside it initially. I think any grassroots movement has to do so. And I think that's what we saw with Trump to some extent and what we're starting to see also to some extent with the alt-right. But I think, there always has to be a level of grassroots activism in there. Otherwise, your movement is just dead. If it's a movement that kind of is that you're trying to spring from the top down, most people, I think, are going to resist it because they view it as somewhat elitist or too white collar or something like that. But if there's grassroots activism behind it, I think it's a good way of doing it.
I think it would be really good for very positive if there was a sort of agorist movement that gained a lot of steam. I mean, basically trying to organize economic activity, let's say, sort of counter system, organizing markets, maybe, or organizing operations that, let's say, violate monopoly protections or, there's all kinds of. I've been in contact with some people in the Dutch Libertarian Party before, and there was this agorist guy who was describing some of the things that people were doing in the Netherlands, and like some people were actually opening up sort of charity services and so on and so forth. And they couldn't, they actually ended up getting shut down because they were violating some like stupid local law or something like that. I mean, I think that things like that, it's, well, let's face it, a lot of politics these days is driven by outrage. And if we had, and you know, this isn't some movement that would necessarily be actively involved in the electoral politics side, but at the same time, it would be sort of complementary in building a sort of outrage culture, or playing into the outrage culture that we see, and sort of building more sympathy for a skepticism of the state.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's a very useful strategy. Relating to agorism, I think it's a useful tactic because I think economic protest is efficient, and I think when it's an area that the state hasn't regulated, there's certainly a space for free markets to slip in and kind of, you know, do its thing. Like I think you can see this with like the cryptocurrency markets and things like that.
Yeah.
But one of the problems I find with it is it's sort of twofold. One, the government can regulate it eventually if they want to. So it can be shut down fairly quickly if you build up enough political momentum against it. Like there could be some huge scandal on like the dark web the next day involving Bitcoin. And all of a sudden Bitcoin could become this hyper-regulated entity and it'll lose all of its value because one of the things Bitcoin sells on is being unregulated. So the value of Bitcoin could be destroyed like that if government were to decide it's a dangerous entity. The other thing I would say is that there's more to government than just economic interactions and economic calculations. And so while I think agorism gets you far to a certain point, you need to have that, whatchamacallit, you have to get into the area where at some point you're using the state apparatus to actually affect a certain amount of change. Does that sound about right? Or
I mean, like, yeah,
somewhat.
I definitely think that, you know, we're going to have to ultimately end up getting control of the state apparatus in order to make changes that we want to make. But again, I think that, yeah, we have to have an effective PR campaign to build sympathy for our cause and to sort of or to build more agreement with what we want, because right now, I mean, we're pretty far out of the mainstream, I would say, and I mean, we're far from the point where we can really, you know, start to expect to hold the reins of governmental authority. So I think, like, it wouldn't be something like, let's say, an agorist project. It wouldn't be something that I would particularly want to invest time in, and I don't have the time for that right now either. But I mean, it would be, I think, very useful if somebody did, and if more people did. And if we ever got the resources to fund something like that, that would certainly be a useful project, I feel like, in terms of the greater political war.
Definitely.
If we could ever get like Koch brothers money or something.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what Cato has right now, and we all know how Cato turned out.
Yeah.
Well, there's nothing wrong with Cato. Well,
I mean,
they do some good work.
It's not the idea.
They do very good research, undoubtedly, but they're very much a Lulbert type of institute. You know, like they're very much Reason magazine type, Gary Johnson type libertarianism, and not sort of the more philosophically robust stuff that's coming out of the Mises Institute or anything.
Yeah, it's I mean, Gary Johnson, that's a whole other topic.
Well,
Yeah,
I never really thought of him as a libertarian, to be honest.
that's
well,
fair.
I
we
think
could
like,
put Ryan
well, I
Rothbard.
mean, I think I probably favor a bit more government than you guys do, coming out from my school. But like, you know, I feel like that we could at least sort of agree that we're approaching things from, you know, a sort of philosophical understanding of libertarian principle. And I think that there are areas where we as libertarians can disagree on and have legitimate disagreements of interpretation. But like the thing with Johnson and Weld is there were just issues where they crossed the line, I feel like. For example, on guns. I mean, Weld's position, that's just not going to fly.
Definitely. And I think Johnson floated the idea of a carbon tax at one point, which was ridiculous.
Well, I mean, like, I could make some argument for it, under the assumption that we're sure about the influence of CO2 emission on climate change. I mean, you know, we need that assumption to be clear to begin with. I think that there would be some argument in terms of preempting property damage, for example, due to that. I think, like, within a Georgist perspective, it would technically be sort of, it would count as a sort of destruction of the value of natural resources and a destruction of future opportunities. But again, that's all based on the assumption that CO2 was influencing climate change. And, well, that's definitely a debate. But I think that there were, you know, there were other things like I would think that I think that Weld's position on guns is a great example. And I mean, I'm sure that I'm a little bit tired right now, so I can't really think of some other examples. But I think that there were others like that where, like,
well, there was the
no argument from a libertarian perspective, like from any interpretation whatsoever.
All you gotta do is just keep saying Chicago, 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 Chicago.
Well, we could put in Rothbard and support David Duke.
Yeah, well, I think that's a bit of a different than what we're talking about.
I know, but I just wanted to say
that was Rothbard during those days. Like, he was, I think he was getting maybe a little bit old and senile.
No, don't pull the Jeffrey Tucker card on us now.
Well, okay, but like, I just remember, like, all right, I remember that there was this one letter he wrote or something, and he just, like, he really sounded like a cranky old man. I mean, he was talking about the libertarian movement at the time and how, like, a lot of them were, you know, enthusiastic about, or like hippies who were enthusiastic about, he called them libertines, who were enthusiastic about sex and drugs, and like he even like pointed out like their enthusiasm for Bauhaus architecture and sort of mocking them. And I'm like, oh god, man.
Well, I mean, I don't think he was wrong in those assessments. I think Murray Rothbard was realizing even back then that the libertarian movement was being taken over by these people who really don't have any philosophical commitment to the principles of liberty and are just like, dude, weed, LMAO. And that was, you know, that was kind of, Hoppe goes into this a little bit where he talks about how the birth of the libertarian movement happened to coincide with the anti-war sentiments of Vietnam, and how both the anti-war sentiment that libertarians shared was also shared by, like, you know, the hippies of the day. And that's kind of like how libertarianism has been infested by leftists who claim to be libertarian. And I mean, you know, I think we see a manifestation of that in Gary Johnson somewhat. I do think he's the symptom of that.
I think Gary Johnson's sort of like a Rockefeller Republican, to be honest.
Really? Centrist?
VC.
You know, but yeah, what was I going to say? Well, but like at the same time, I mean, you know, I think it's perfectly credible to be a libertarian who cares about principle while, you know, having enthusiasm for, you know, the occasional Mary Jane and even Bauhaus architecture.
Well, yeah, I think Rothbard was pointing to those things as an underlying kind of trend. Like he's saying, well, their enthusiasm for these things was as deep as their commitment to libertarianism went. I don't think those were the only things he was just criticizing them on.
Well, I mean, that's fair. I just like he did. I mean, you would have to admit though, like he's and I don't like. Okay, I don't like agree with some things that Rothbard said, but and I don't even like hate the guy. I think he's got a certain charm to him as well that I kind of admire. But he was a pretty aggressive dude.
Yeah, he was.
He attacked his own kind of people as well.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he wasn't
over small disagreements.
Well, I think you guys should read about Ludwig von Mises, because Ludwig von Mises, when Murray Rothbard went into libertarianism and tried to make allies out of the leftists, Ludwig von Mises was immediately like, no, don't even, it's not going to work. And eventually Murray caught on, kind of, but it was a bit too late. But, you know, if you think Rothbard was bad, Mises was hyper staunch and hyper libertarian and sort of paleo-conservative in a way, to the point where he would get into far worse shouting matches with people. I think there's an incident recorded of him talking with Hayek on the issue, and I don't think it devolved into shouting, but I think he called Hayek a socialist or something. It was pretty intense.
I thought it was Milton Friedman. He called Milton Friedman a socialist.
Oh yeah, that was it.
Just that was funny.
Yeah. Paleo. I just like, that's just a laughable word to me.
Also, it'd be nice to have a Bryce Barry Goldwater conservative.
Well, see, Barry Goldwater didn't get elected because, like, I think it was because of his message and things he advocated for.
Like, he was a very firm constitutionalist, and he would be a libertarian conservative by today's standards.
Another problem is he was, well, I think one of the reasons why, I think the two reasons why he didn't get elected was because, number one, he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and number two, he was pro-choice, which back then, pretty much most Americans were more pro-life back then. I mean, back then, I don't think abortion was a cool thing, which today it still isn't, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm pro-life. And I think that, like, I don't have a problem with people being pro-choice, but I do think that, yes, you shouldn't, like, a libertarians, because even though I'm not a libertarian anymore, I'm a conservative, I got attacked by other libertarians for being pro-life back when I was a libertarian, because they said, well, that's not true libertarianism. And I'm like, well, what is? Because it seems like to me all libertarianism has become, not entirely, but I feel like the face has become like, no more wars, let there be abortions, and let there be weed.
Whatever happened to end the Fed? Whatever happened to that chant? Then just fucking weed and just chant to smoke weed.
Yeah. I'm not saying there's anything wrong. Like, if you're for marijuana and all that stuff, that's okay. But don't make that your face, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think we have to focus on economics.
Because, like, Yeah, but you also have to have a good like face and a good image to get it out there, and that's kind of why the left, we're very successful in California and with immigrants, especially the non-white immigrants, because they work to make sure that they have a better approach than the right does, and they always make sure that they're always 10 steps ahead of the right, and that's why immigrants intend usually intend to support the left and the right, or libertarians, conservatives,
Yeah.
whatever you want to say.
Well, I wanted to bring back one point, because I mean, we just you alluded to the pragmatic culture, alluded to the topic of libertarianism sort of arising in alliance with the new left. I mean, I don't think that really right now we should be making necessarily an alliance with either the left or the right, because I feel like that they're operating sort of outside of outside, like in sort of a paradigm that's outside of what we're really interested in.
Well,
and I feel like that what we should be doing is we should be looking towards, let's say, sections of both the left and the right that have some common interests with us, that we can maybe approach on certain topics as
I think
sort of like icebreaker, and we sort of go from there, like not forming alliances, but sort of trying to build bridges with dialogue, if you will. Because I feel like that we can build quite a coalition among people who are interested in individual liberty, who maybe are coming at things from a different perspective. Because I mean, the thing about liberty is it does allow a pretty flexible framework for people with different interests to sort of pursue those interests, if you will, if you see what I'm saying.
Well, I think that's sort of the problem that Rothbard was seeing as the libertarian movement evolved. Is you try to befriend these people on sort of these, very minute details or relatively smaller issues that you happen to agree with, and then all of a sudden, they're kind of co-opting your movement from within on the larger issues that they happen to think are right, but you never agreed to in the first place. And I think that's, I think that's sort of the issue, is the infiltration by left libertarians, because the conception of liberty on the left is nothing at all similar to the conception of liberty on the right. Like, what left libertarians define as liberty is not Lockean or does not have roots in a classically liberal tradition whatsoever. And so I think to just sort of say, maybe try to win them over for votes is it's a strategy that I would caution us against.
Well, but okay, I think this is a pretty good discussion for us to have right now. And I actually wanted to touch on this earlier, but I think it's a good time to bring this up. Wait, do you have something that you want to say, or?
Well, I was going to say something about that left-right thing about libertarianism. See, the point about left libertarianism, I never understand it. I never understood it, and I probably never will. Libertarian socialism just doesn't make any sense, that sort of thing. And when libertarians say we need to look towards the left and look towards the right and find, bring together what we can because we got different views. I'm just kind of like, nah, man, you're a small government guy. As a conservative, I always say to libertarians, you say that, and I'm like, nah, dude, you claim to be a small government guy. You're on the same train as us, dude. Yeah, we have different views, conservatives and libertarians, but we're on the same wing. I hate to break it to you.
Well, I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss anyone or anything here. I guess let's just go back to what I was going to ask here. How would you all define the left and the right? What do you think is really the paradigm at work there?
I think it's. Oh, sorry, you go first. So.
No. I think he asked you first. You go ahead. I'll go second. I'll go next.
Well, I think the big paradigm defining the difference between the two is, in a larger sense, it's the being pro hierarchy versus being pro anti hierarchy, or being pro equality, because equality would imply the lack of a hierarchy because everyone's equal and nobody's above anything else. But I believe in terms of the Overton window in which those larger views express themselves, it's the belief in positive rights versus negative rights, whereas negative rights can still allow a hierarchy to thrive and flourish, because if you're just, it's negative rights meaning the right from something, like the right from being forced to do something. Positive rights imply that you have the right to something because everybody's equal, and so therefore this notion of property being shared, or this notion that because we're all equal, we're all entitled to the same thing. So I think that's sort of the paradigm I look at left and right with.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll let you go ahead, and I've got some thoughts. I'm going to sort of.
Well, the left-right spectrum. I think it's been I don't follow the cube one, the authoritarian libertarian one with the 4 cube. No, I followed the one that has center right, far right, center left, far left. I believe that the more collectivist, I even made a video about this on Right Wing Federation, which you can go check out, what the political spectrum looks like and what it should be. And what I said it should be is, the more collectivist you are, the farther left you go. The more individualist you are, the farther right you go. Like I described conservatives and libertarians as people on center right, because despite some differences, we usually advocate for smaller government. And I think far right is where it should be no government, basically anarchy, progressives, stuff like that, center left, fascists and communists, all far left, as far as I'm concerned, because they may claim to be different and hate each other, but they both advocate the same amount of collectivism. Like in order to push their agenda through, it requires just about the same amount of collectivism.
Okay, I'll go ahead and respond now. First of all, I'll say I agree with pragmatic culture when he, from the beginning, defines the difference between the left and the right as the difference on the question of, let's say, equality versus hierarchy. I wouldn't extrapolate that, though, to a difference between positive rights and negative rights. Because, for example, if you have a society where negative rights are enforced, and they're enforced with equality before the law, so everybody's negative rights are enforced with equal degree. I mean, you could have a society that sort of organically develops in, let's say, quite an equal way through mere freedom of association. If that's how the culture sort of develops in the society, you could end up with that result. So I would say that it's not really necessarily proper to equate a desire for equality with, let's say, a demand for positive rights. So I would stick with the equality versus hierarchy paradigm. And then basically it ultimately, and I actually disagree with Soul Drift on the sort of cubed paradigm. I think it's ultimately a question of, okay, well, how do you want to, let's say, go about getting the kind of society that you want to see, like let's say an egalitarian or a hierarchical society. And to the extent that you want to centrally plan this, into existence, centrally engineer your vision into existence? Or are you someone who's just going to get out of the way and, let people organize it for themselves?
Well, I mean,
I
like,
think that that's where there is a sort of legitimacy in the left libertarian and right libertarian sort of
but
idea.
just like, but I just don't know.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I just don't know how you can say you're a libertarian, but at the same time advocate for like social justice and wealth redistribution. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, like, for example, in Georgism, like, even though we're not really left libertarian, we're really, like, quite, I would say, center libertarian. I mean, on my test on that political compass thing, I'm like just a smidge to the right of the center line. I mean, like within Georgism, we would say, okay, well, land is ethically sort of common property, therefore land value tax would be sort of like a compensation for a violation of rights. I mean, that would be one argument. I mean, in terms of like social justice and stuff, it's really more about, I would say, to what degree do you want the state to enforce this? I mean, I don't really care if like people are out there and advocating for certain things privately. That's their right. But when they want the government to step in and start regulating society and engineering their vision, that's when we have a problem. I think that also, like, the question about libertarian socialists, as far as I understand it, and I'm not a libertarian socialist at all, but as far as I understand it, I mean, libertarian socialists want to accomplish their vision outside of the state. They want to accomplish their vision through voluntary action and voluntary organization. They want, for example, to see the emergence of more like private worker cooperation and cooperatives and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't like, we can disagree with that overall vision, but I don't think that sort of attitude, as long as they're not going to end up violating anyone's negative rights and how they want to go about trying to accomplish their end goal.
Well, I think
I think that that's not something to just like dismiss and say, okay, well, let's not talk to these people.
Well, I think they have kind of dismissed the idea of negative rights entirely, because they're the people who, ostensibly claim to be anarchists, but if you tell them that you're going to take away welfare, they throw a hissy fit over it, because they're fine when the state engages in wealth redistribution and, is moving closer and closer towards some sort of dictatorship of the proletariat. But when you're actually trying to remove state force, unless it's on something like drugs, like if you're trying to free up markets, they don't view that as a good thing, because their conception of force is, corporations can initiate force. And I'm not talking like Coca-Cola death squads here. I'm talking, can you mute yourself, Seal?
Just a sec. Yeah, hold on.
Oh, there we go. But they're the type of people who say that they would go into people's businesses and forcefully redistribute their wealth, because they're the type of people who repeat the mantra, property is theft, which is a nonsensical term, because if property is theft, then you can't really have property, because one of the intrinsic rights of property is ownership. And so if just ownership is theft, then there isn't ownership anyway. So I think when you have people who repeat this type of mantra, maybe they're trying to complete their goals outside of the state apparatus, although I think plenty of them have expressed sympathy for using the state. I think even if they weren't using the state, it would still be bad idea to ally yourselves with these people, only because their conception of liberty is just that far flung from ours.
Yeah, well, I mean,
one thing I would add to that is, I mean, I definitely see where you're coming from. There are some people who do sort of advocate for more state regulation of society. in particular when it comes to corporate power. But I think that there are others who actually, like, there's one guy I've been talking to who's a mutualist, and I mean, he doesn't really seem to want to go very far in that direction at all. I mean, he's quite fond of George's ideas.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call
but
mutualists. I wouldn't necessarily call mutualists left anarchists, I would say, but I'm talking more towards the people like you know, the ANCOMs, the anarcho-socialists, the libertarian socialists, like the type of people you see.
The anarcho-syndicalists?
Yeah, anarcho-syndicalists, those guys, people like you'd see Bad Mouse associating with, just because, you know, he's someone who I know promotes the ideology off the top of my head.
Well, okay, like those kinds of people, I agree. I mean, it's going to be very hard to connect with, like, the Bad Mouses of the world. But I think that there is a sort of, like, let's say, left libertarian view that, like, the mutualists, they are in favor of like a free market society, but have a particular vision of, like, what a free market society would look like. And I mean, they would be like this mutualist guy, for example. One thing that, you know, has come up when I've had the discussion with him is we're both against minimum wage laws. And I mean, he actually makes the argument that, well, in the end, that would be quite contrary to the development of co-ops, because, I mean, that would raise the cost for co-ops to end up forming. So, I mean, I think that there are those who, like, you would say are kind of left in their thinking of wanting, like, a more egalitarian society in some sense, who actually are, I think you could argue, pretty legitimately libertarian in their approach.
I think you're right about that. I think there's a bounds to which it works. Like, I think working with mutualists to a certain extent isn't something that's completely out of the range of possibility, because, you know, they're not the anarcho-syndicalists or the anarcho-communists or the Bad Mouses or the Zexizes. Well, Zexizy is a Marxist, so that analogy doesn't work. But, you know, you get my point. And so I think there is a bounds on which it can work. But at the same time, mutualists are an interesting crowd, because some of them can lean far more to the syndicalist side. Some of them could essentially be ANCAP. And so there needs to be, I'm trying to be pragmatic and avoid purity spiraling here, but at the same time, we don't want any more Gary Johnson, so we do have to be a little bit wary.
Well, but I mean, I think Gary Johnson is, you know, he has a few degrees of separation from, like, Bad Mouse.
Obviously.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to have other Ron Paul movement again.
You know, Ron Paul, like, yeah, he was like, yeah, and there are some particular things where, like, I would disagree with the philosophy, but I'm still a fan.
Definitely.
I remember I volunteered for the campaign in 2008 and did quite a lot of campus activism. Went to New Hampshire and South Carolina, and I mean, I'm just as enthusiastic about him now as I was then. I mean, even though there were some points of disagreement, the guy just, from a point of integrity alone, like, he's a winner.
Well, what was your reaction to the newsletters when you saw them?
I was, you know, I definitely felt a little bit devastated. I remember, like, I had to, that was a little bit after sort of, like, let's say the more active electoral side of my volunteer efforts had ended. And, like, I mean, I know the guy. He doesn't, I've actually met him a couple of times. And he doesn't have a prejudicial bone in his body. Like I knew that. But it was like it was pretty shocking, and I mean that it's that happened was I think still quite regrettable, because I think it took a toll in the end. I mean, it was definitely, I feel like, sort of a mental block for quite a lot of people who otherwise would have been pretty positively disposed. And
I think,
I mean,
yeah.
it's just like you really have to. I feel like from that perspective, you kind of have to go back in time and really question, why did we, why did they think it was such a great idea to sort of
Well,
make those kinds of associations and push that kind of rhetoric, because like
Well,
it,
I
it,
think
it
I
was
think
it was a
looking
big
back,
cost in the end,
yeah,
Rothbard wrote that they should use right-wing populist tactics, and Ron Paul took his.
well, hold on. I wouldn't say shove off Ron Paul's writings on Rothbard just because he said endorse right-wing populism. I think looking back, the newsletters don't say anything particularly damning. I think when you look at them, because the one newsletter that I always see thrown around is where he called, like, I think it's like 95% of blacks like criminals within the DC Beltway. And what he was basing that on is the fact that amongst the black population within DC, 85% have a criminal record, like, and what's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's recidivism or something. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but that's the number he was basing it on. And then he said because DC is a politically left city, that number is actually probably a little bit higher, and so he tacked on an extra 10%. Now, obviously, it's not the best thing to say in terms of optics, but I think the media took it and made it into something that was far worse than it actually was.
Yeah, but like there were other segments where, let's say, there was some less than charitable language that was used toward, particular, let's say, like demographics.
Yeah.
And that's like, and I mean, there were sort of like there was a section where David Duke was praised, and that's just, if you want to talk about crime statistics and sort of put it in the broader perspective of like policy, and from this motivation of, well, let's like actually solve the problem and try to find a way to end up with a healthier community, because like the people in these communities are ultimately suffering from this, and I mean we should be like interested in what we can do to get them out of it. That's one thing, but like I feel like there was a sort of strategy there in terms of like the kind of appeal they were trying to make, and it
wasn't for most people.
It's like I
have a very hard time personally defending those newsletters. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't detract from how I feel about Ron Paul, the man. And I would say that there's definitely a sense of political correctness going a bit too far in political discourse. I mean, I understand those concerns, but I mean, I think there's a right way and a wrong way to sort of go about ultimate political strategy, and I feel like that was in the long run kind of a miscalculation.
That's a fair enough statement. Yeah. Voltaire, you were going to say something before, I think.
Oh, well, I was gonna say something. Well, he was talking about like 95% or 85% of blacks, are have a criminal background, and said something about people in those communities are suffering. I was just gonna say it's a hard process because I was gonna go back to what I said about like the left and immigrants and why when immigrants come here or pretty much go to Canada or something, they give their votes and support to mostly the left and not the right, because when it comes to approaching and appealing, the left is 10 steps ahead. So it's like, and that not, and what I meant was about immigrants, that also applies to like the non-white communities as well. And they run the non-white communities for all this time. And yeah, and I think that's kind of the main reason why they're suffering with all their, their collectivism and stuff like that.
Well, but at the same time, I feel like there's an opportunity for us in some of these communities. And there's been some statistics indicating that, for example, immigrants
Well,
enterprises at a bit of a higher rate than native-born people. So, I mean, I feel like that there is a segment of these communities that's quite entrepreneurial, and that can be reached with a message of individual freedom.
But the question
that values that, and I think it's like it should be part of, let's say, I mean, I'm not suggesting like targeting based on some type of identity politics or anything, but I think it would be a mistake to write off the appeal that libertarianism can have, let's say more broadly.
I mean, like, I'm not saying that I don't disagree with that part. It's just like the problem is like ever since like the left, the Democrats took over these communities, it's like it's been nonstop brainwashing, and they've been trying, and even before they took over, they were still doing it before that, just like brainwash and say you can't support this side because they support like capitalism, and capitalism will hurt you more than it will hurt the white man or hurt white people, some stuff like that.
Well, I think
Because I remember like some socialist giving a speech. I forget his name. It was back during the 2010 governors. I don't know. I don't remember his name, but like he was on the socialist ballot day, and he talked about how capitalism hurts like non-whites more than it hurts whites, and that's why non-whites should not go like support capitalism. Or I don't remember the whole speech because all I know it was just a bunch of bullshit.
Well, I mean, that's kind of racist, isn't it? Because you're kind of saying, well, non-whites can succeed in capitalism.
I think, well,
exactly.
I think we should sort of take that targeted message somewhat, and we should, because I think that is a type. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily racist, but it is certainly a form of identity politics, and I think we can kind of piggyback off that, though, in a sense where, we have to rebrand capitalism as something that, everybody can be successful in. But at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that, it doesn't discriminate. It's a system that can, make everybody successful, and it has. But at the same time, when it comes down to it, we have to emphasize the fact that not everybody wins the game. And there are plenty of people who don't. And I think that's where, the left gets these people sometimes, because they're worried about failure, and they like the idea of just having a big safety net to fall back into and kind of taking advantage of that safety net instead of going out on their own. And so I think that's something we also have to be conscious of. We have to, remind everyone that, you don't need a government safety net. You can just have, there's a community of good charitable people around you as well. That doesn't consist of, your local food stamp, desk.
Well, I think, one of the things we should be emphasizing, regulatory structures that ultimately end up penalizing, or that ultimately end up limiting opportunity for people. That ultimately end up limiting people's ability to become entrepreneurs. That ultimately end up, sort of anti-competitive laws that stifle competition and so on and so forth. I think that there are very powerful avenues for us there on some topics. I would also, on the on the winners and losers part of capitalism.
Well, there's
that,
competition.
Yeah, I think, but the thing is, though, and this is where I would argue from a Georgist perspective, is that there doesn't really necessarily need to be, let's say, winners and losers in a capitalist system that fully respects private property rights to the product of labor and capital. It's like, and this is, again, I'm probably going to sound leftist when I say this, but this is where moving to, I would argue that sort of moving toward a land value tax would be a way of having, like, moving toward a system of free market capitalism where people, where we essentially wouldn't end up having losers. Because ultimately, when you have economic growth and advancement in technology and commerce, land rents go up, and this is something that will end up sort of choking off productive opportunity in the end. And it's a way that we can correct for that without causing deadweight loss in the economy. And it's a way that we can ultimately spend money on in, fairly, I would argue, fairly reasonable ways to further open opportunities for people. I wouldn't actually, like, on the welfare side of it, I think that we need to move away from the concept of a welfare state for sure. I think there's a very powerful argument to be made against especially how it's constructed now, because you have sort of like these targeted benefits for particular things that sort of end up distorting people's incentives. You also have things like income testing with the earned income tax credit that ultimately end up penalizing additional initiative and with one's labor. And I think maybe, though, we should be a little bit open-minded when it comes to, like, let's say, welfare payments, because for one, we're not going to be able to bring down the welfare state immediately, if that's a goal of ours even.
Well,
so
I support.
The question would become, okay, well, how can we have something that maybe takes care of enough people so that families have a reasonable amount of support, in a way that doesn't cause, like, really perverse incentives, economic incentives, in a way that doesn't reduce the incentive to work, or in particular the incentive for families to stay together. And I would say, for example, Charles Murray, who has been brought up in this conversation, he did some work about the sort of welfare state in the United States and how it was structured. And, it was fairly persuasive stuff that he was saying about the effect that this was having in communities. But he's also quite recently came out in favor of a universal basic income as sort of a replacement for the entire welfare state as it is. And I mean, I feel like that's something that maybe we should be open-minded to. It would also allow us, for example, to make the argument of eliminating something that I would argue is far more destructive and causes far more losers than is necessary in the capitalist economy. That being, for example, the minimum wage law and a lot of other restrictions in labor markets that prevent people from being hired. And I feel like that if we can get to this point, especially with the sort of trends that we would end up seeing with land being resulting from a land value tax to accomplish this, I feel like that we could get to a pretty decent place in terms of accomplishing some goals with this.
Yeah. Honestly, you remind me of you remind me a little bit of Hayek, the libertarian George.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of Hayek.
Also, do you think what's your thoughts on the free negative income tax?
I mean, I think that it's it's certainly an interesting idea. It's within the sphere of a universal basic income. I mean, the only thing with the negative income tax I don't like is the tapering for earned income, because I mean, I think that it does sort of penalize work in some way. I think that people who sort of propose that, like for example Charles Murray, I mean, what he was proposing is essentially a negative income tax, because the benefit ends up tapering after about $30,000 of earned income. I mean, I think that they introduced that feature to try to increase the sort of individual level, along with introducing like a minimum age for earning it. Like Charles Murray said that he wants it to start at 21 years of age. I don't really think that that's really the necessary approach that would be taken with something like this. I think the idea would be more that you would pay people, like each individual, but give them a smaller check, such that no one individually is going to have anywhere near close to their basic needs paid for with like their individual income stream, or even like half of them or most of them, but where when cohabitating it would be enough to take care of, let's say, most basic needs. Let's say for like a family of 4 or something like that. And I think that that would reverse quite a lot of the incentives that are pretty perverse in the current welfare state, which by giving, I mean, it's really kind of preposterous to me that you would structure benefits based on one's marital status. That's just seems to me quite a destructive thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that Murray makes some other very interesting arguments for his proposal, in terms of, like, for example, he emphasizes a restoration of civic culture, where basically, and he brings up this example of a couple being together and the guy basically like having a drinking problem or so on and so forth. And with the income stream coming in, his girlfriend basically saying, okay, well, I'm going to help you out a little bit here, but you're on my purse right now, so get your act together, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So like it's this sort of idea of allowing the moral agency of people to come into play in their interaction with others. to accomplish things that the state is trying to accomplish by sort of central engineering, if you know what I mean.
What's your thoughts on this pragmatic? Well, he's probably not, but so far I find this like a acceptable idea. It's reasonable, well thought out, and I think it could work. I think it can work in under the right conditions, and introducing a culture of self responsibility will also help. As speaking of Charles Murray, I think a book that everybody should read is "Coming Apart" by Say White America, where he documents the thing. It's a good book. I think people should read it. Yeah. Just, this is a
I mean, does anyone else have any thoughts or?
Well, I was gonna say something about welfares.
Hold on. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, did you not hear me before?
No.
No.
I guess not.
Oh, balls. Okay, I thought you were all just ignoring me. I guess it was my mic. Whoops. I have a couple comments on universal basic income. I think the first of which being the practicality of implementing it as a policy, because a lot of times we're promised that we'll get this policy in exchange for, slashing away all these others, and 99 times out of 100 that never happens. So the implementation of a universal basic income while simultaneously stripping away the welfare state as we know it would be a massive political challenge. And so I think you'd have to go into implementing something like that incredibly cautiously. In my mind, it's just not worth the risk at all, because what I see happening is you get universal basic income and then you have the welfare state on top of it. And now you're just deeper down the bog. And the second thing I would say in response to the proposal for universal basic income would be that the universal basic income as like a single paycheck that you get every, week or month or so as a solution to eliminating all these other welfare programs doesn't actually solve the disincentivization that welfare programs cause. Because what happens with welfare is that, when you're on this sort of free money, the idea is that if you work and lose this free money, the work you're doing isn't worth the new money that you're earning. And so it's easier to not work and still get some money than to work and get only slightly better money. So what I would say to that is that and to relate the fact to universal basic income still has that same problem, except now instead of receiving money from all these smaller different programs, you're just receiving them from one big program. So you still have this disincentivization. And I think the civic culture that Murray advocates is actually in direct opposition to this, because this notion of private charity and helping people out is a much better way of going about doing it, because when you have private individuals doling out charity, you have the ability to just stop it. Whereas if you're trying to tack conditions onto receiving free government money, you're going to receive all these accusations of racism and all these other evil claims like, oh, you're anti-poor, oh, you're anti-single mother, oh, you're anti-this, that, and the other. Where if it's just private charity, you say, no, it's my money that you're wasting, and so I don't want you to have any more of it. And in that way, you can cut people off when you think they're freeloading, whereas the state just allows this freeloading to continue indefinitely. So I'd agree with Murray that the return of a civic type of culture would certainly be beneficial all around, but that what he's advocating in the form of universal basic income would absolutely destroy any chance of that happening.
Well, I would disagree there. I think that the idea would be that with this extra income stream, that people sort of with their own initiative would be more conscious with others in their relationships with other people. I mean,
The
example I
statistics
brought
I
up
would tell
earlier.
you are not in your favor there, because there's very much a lot of research done on, if you're receiving something free and like delayed time preference, what it kind of relates to you there. So I would tell you that the existing data we have on that does not support that hypothesis.
Well, but I mean, there's also, well, okay, so a couple of things. One, I mean, it depends on like what the level of the benefit is. Like, I mean, if you're just going to give basically enough money to meet all basic needs, then okay, that could end up being quite a strong disincentive to work. But if there are still needs that need to be met, then there's still quite, I would say, I mean, there's still an incentive to work.
There
Um,
certainly is some, but
yeah,
what we find, and I think what Murray goes on, what's kind of the secondary undertone, and I think Murray chooses not to focus on in his book, The Bell Curve, is that anything that makes, living at the bottom slightly more bearable still acts as a disincentive. And so while you're right, there are still incentives there to get people to move up. There's plenty that still disincentivizes that moving up too. And it becomes a game of, betting on individuals with, taxpayer money at a certain point.
well, but I think in some cases, I mean, there will be cases in which the bet will pay off quite handsomely. I mean, I've seen some arguments from people in Silicon Valley, for example, about the impact that this could have on sort of startup on startup activity, on entrepreneurship, basically enabling people to have a bit of support while they're developing an idea, perhaps even having a bit of security against a small business loan to get started. So I mean, there will be those cases, I feel like, and I mean it's ultimately I think we do want to be incentivizing work in a very strong way, and we need to be incentivizing sort of self-initiative to make one's way in life. And I mean, I think that that's a sort of moral value that we should prioritize. I think it's good to encourage this in a policy.
I agree with you. The moral value
offering a little bit of support in doing so. I don't think that that's necessarily counter to that. Like, it would have to be structured properly, I feel like. And but where we would agree is that the current welfare state, as it's been constructed, is something that has quite disincentivized people to sort of get off their own ass and make their way.
Yeah.
Well, I think when you say it should be structured right, I think you're absolutely right. It does need to be structured right. And personally, I would tell you it would be somewhat naive to trust that the government is going to be structuring it right based on their past record. And I mean, we both agree that some sort of, safety net would be beneficial, but I think the managers of that safety net it's better off having the people directly managing their own safety nets and what they do with their own money, as opposed to having the bureaucracy kind of bungle around with it, is what I would end up saying.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's say that, I mean, we were moving in sort of like a devolution direction with, and this is a completely like hypothetical scenario, that we were able to move in a more devolution direction where we're sort of scaling down the role of the federal government and its involvement in life, and more governments or more power is given to local governments and so on and so forth. Let's say in a situation where like we have my sort of Georgia's paradise of a land value tax type of situation and collecting land rents. I mean, do you think that maybe it would be sort of reasonable for, like, let's say, a local level sort of safety net approach? One that, like, more directly meets the needs of people actually in the community, and one that's more responsive.
I think it'd be a much better way if it's much localized than a total nationalized safety net with very obvious problems with that.
Yeah, I think it has to be more localized, because if you try to, I mean, you could possibly say that maybe something like, I suppose you could try to do it on like the county level, where you're trying to institute universal basic income through like a charity fund that the county runs, because I believe, county or town governments can be, marginally efficient and almost actually operate like a small business in themselves. But usually that's not the case, I would say. But I think you could organize it at that level. But the case I would argue against is still that, just with the calculation that goes into doing something like this, when Mises and Hayek bring up their own calculation problem, I think it comes into play more so than ever in a question like this, because charity is something where government is very bad at dissuading freeloaders, because whenever you try to implement some sort of discriminatory policy against a certain type of freeloader, you always get accused of being something negative politically. And as such, it becomes less and less likely that you actually, implement it, and the freeloaders just end up staying. So if you could find a situation where it was that freeloaders are accounted for and under universal basic income, I'd be much more willing to support it. But I don't think there's any realistic way for that to be done. And I would maintain then that it'll become a net loss for the government and for the taxpayers. And I think it ought to be stopped on that basis.
Well, okay, let's just work with like the theoretical that it was structured properly. I mean, in terms of the political side of things, we also have a bit of our own calculation problem. Because if we were to get into power in some sort, we probably wouldn't have even enough to like break down the entire state to begin with. So I think it's like, I think having a little bit, at least some openness to like this type of idea as a program, and thinking about it a bit. I mean, I think it would be useful to sort of like, let's say, a broader medium to long-term strategy in order to build something of a base of people.
Well,
I mean, ultimately,
I think you're going to draw away.
Changing a lot of minds for what we like, if we're going to get into power anyways. And I mean, I think at the very least, going with this sort of reformist approach is kind of a smoothener, if you will.
I mean, I think you're going to do a lot more to drive away any real right-wingers from your movement by advocating UBI, because it's such a foreign concept to pretty much anybody who believes in a free market process, even, somewhat not on the level that we as libertarians do, even, just kind of, moderately Republican people. Like, that's going to be a scary thought to them. And I think it's scary simply because, when you're looking at actually implementing it as a real solution, you can't just base it on a hypothetical where the system happens to work well. You have to take into account the political reality of what's happening, that being, how well can you actually tear down the welfare state, and how well can you account for freeloaders who are then going to become a burden on the system. And I think if we try to use this as a universal basic income as a political tactic to gain votes, without taking into account the political reality, I think we're going to end up doing a much greater disservice to ourselves than and our movement than we actually will to, you know, gain support. But I would say there are other tactics we can do this with. Like, there are other forms of charity I think we can implement in order to create a safety net that don't necessarily involve the welfare state, like the incentivization of private charities, like, you know, no apps, like all tax cuts for you know, some like Catholic charity or something like the Salvation Army, something like that. There are other things we could do to incentivize a safety net that I think would go over much better with the more free market types that we're trying to persuade and bring over to our side. And I think that would work well with even the leftist paradigm as well. So I think there are better options than UBI to do what you're trying to do politically, is what I would say. Although I think, you know, we can entertain the idea. I think we still have to be cognizant of the political realities of it all.
Yeah. I mean, like, how I would respond to the political side, to like the argument you're making, particularly when it comes to the more like free market, let's say conservative type of oriented thinkers.
Well,
I mean, what I would wait, go okay. Let's go ahead and let Soul Drift 7. I'm sure he's been waiting for a while.
well, I was just going to quickly say about welfare and Social Security. As a conservative, I do support it, but I only support it to a certain extent, limited. Even Burkeanism supports it to a limited extent. But I think it needs to be seen in some ways, not in every ways. I mean, like if you got health issues like I do or something like that, yeah, you're fine. But if you don't, you're just trying to get like, you know, just trying to get some help and this and that, then we need to change like the texture and the image that we give when we offer Social Security and welfare, and that is it's a hand up, not a handout.
Okay. Well, okay. So
that's the problem, as I think more people treat it as more of a handout. You got too many people treating it as more of a handout than a hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that thinking. But going back to what I was saying, on the free market side.
Sorry.
So like, oh no reason to be sorry. That was actually a very good point. But like on the free market thing, the way I see it is this. So, I think that if this would be, and I wouldn't support the universal basic income in which, unless it was paired with Georgia's tax reform. Because I mean, to me, the two are very intimately linked, and I mean, really doing one without doing the other doesn't solve the ultimate problem from the perspective of Georgia's, in terms of the effect of land on wealth distribution. So I'll go ahead and state that first. Like, there's definitely a condition for me. What I would also say, though, is that there are other, like, going with this approach, for example, allows us to get rid of the penalties, can allow us to get rid of like even bigger penalties on the free market, and bigger barriers in the market than, let's say, just like the transfer of cash to someone. Like, for example, with the Georgia's approach, I mean, the whole point is to get rid of taxes on productive activity, to get rid of taxes on labor, to get rid of taxes on capital, to get rid of taxes on trade, so that we get out of the way of market and the market's ability to generate wealth. And also, I mean, going with the universal basic income side of this would allow us to get rid of the minimum wage. And I think that this is one particular thing that we should be making a pretty aggressive case on. I mean, it's one of those that will get us in, it will get some shit flung our way from left wingers when we talk about getting rid of the minimum wage. I mean, that's one of the things that they love to attack us for the most. But this is demonstrably a very destructive policy. I mean, there's been some studies that claim to, some econometric studies that claim to find non-significant effects of the minimum wage on employment, but all those studies have serious flaws in their model construction that are certainly going to hide it. There's actually this economist named David Newmark at the University of California in Irvine who's done some good work on this and did a paper a few years ago that looked into this. And I think that that's so. Going with this approach and getting rid of these frictions on markets to create wealth, to create jobs, which in the end will end up increasing demand for labor and increasing wages in such a way that the incentive for work will be a lot stronger, even with some form of like a universal basic income funded from land rents.
What I would posit to you is that because UBI hasn't been implemented yet and we really only have theoretical models to work off of, what I would tell you is that, yes, the welfare state has done enormous damage, and undoubtedly the negative effects of the minimum wage could be felt quite strongly. But no matter what, I would tell you, if you were to implement UBI, you would see those negative effects implemented tenfold, even if you did manage to get rid of everything else. I would still, I would posit it, and I'm sorry, I'm actually going to have to just leave it there. But thank you guys so much for entertaining me. Thanks for having me on, Volt. I'm just going to have to bounce now. Sorry.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. Hey, I'll follow you on Twitter. It was really, I really enjoyed the discussion.
Same here. Thanks, guys.
See you later. All right. You were saying?
What was I saying?
Oh, are we done? Or are we moving to the topic?
I don't know. I mean, is there something you want to talk about? Maybe it's on your mind.
Well, I already said my opinion on welfare. What about gun politics? Ooh, my favy.
Yeah, I mean, that's one to really hold the fort on, I feel like.
Well, do you believe in any type of gun control, or do you think no restrictions on guns? We should all have the right to bear arms with any kind of gun we want.
Well, like I think, well, for example, I'm not in favor of private nuclear weapon ownership. I think that there's a particular case that could be made in that example where, if a nuclear weapon explodes, there's a 100% probability of damage to property, if not
destruction of private property and reckless endangerment.
Yeah, I mean that's inevitable. So like even if there's some sort of mistake that triggers the nuclear weapon, I mean that just can't be allowed, I feel like. I think it's, and this is one that Bill Weld tried to extend to guns, and I think he made quite a logical, he made a very fallacious comparison. Because I mean, when you fire a gun, it's not inevitable that property will be damaged or, anyone will be killed. Like, if you've got like a farm or something and you go out with your AR-15 target practicing on your farm, then like, I mean, nobody's really getting hurt.
Yeah, but pretty much every time I ever shot a gun was like out at a farm with beer cans or beer bottles, or at a shooting range, or at some animals.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we want to take a perspective of taking gun violence seriously from a policy perspective, I think it would be better to go from with an approach of more positive incentives for things like safe storage and things like that.
Well, it's just like people. It's just like they always. The left, even some the so-called left libertarians, I've even heard some of them make this argument that you don't need like an M60 machine gun or an Uzi, like you don't need it to hunt or anything, this and that. And if we got rid of all these amount of weapons, we would have less murders. And a part of me is like, Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, like, they don't consider the possibility of a black market developing. That's like, it's ultimately like they like to point to Australia as an example of a country that heavily restricted gun use and where gun violence went down. But I mean, gun ownership is so more pervasive in the United States.
Yeah, but
there's just no way that you won't end up with a black market in the U.S. And I think ultimately it's again, you can't collectively blame gun owners for the violence of one particular gun owner. That's ultimately what it comes down to. It's really a matter of principle. Do you have the right to do with your property as you wish, if it doesn't harm anyone else, or don't you?
Well,
and it's a fundamental level. It's a fundamental question of principle, I feel like.
Well, if somebody wants to, mow down a bunch of empty beer bottles with a 9mm, they should have the right to. I mean, as long as it's not like, as long as it's in their backyard or whatever, I don't see why they should not be allowed. I mean, like, and that's the thing, like my grandma, who's for gun control, well, she's okay for semi-automatics and pump action shotguns, but she's like, why do you need these fully automatic weapons? You don't need to hunt with them or stuff like that. I'm like, well, how do you know? If you're in Alaska hunting freaking Kodiak bears, I think a fully automatic weapon would be much more useful than a fucking 12 gauge. Because Kodiak bears are fucking enormous, dude. They're like 8 feet tall and they weigh almost 1,100 pounds.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know, like like I was saying, if you could offer incentives for people to, let's say, take additional care in how they store weapons, I mean, if you can come up with like common sense ways, like maybe offering incentives to keep semi-automatic weapons at like a shooting range or something, or
they actually have a similar, like, because you mentioned Australia. I think the shooting ranges in Australia are similar to that, where they have just like the handguns there. I could be wrong about this. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I think, like, because I remember seeing some footage of a shooting range in Australia, and they have all the guns like literally tied, like chained to the table on the range.
Yeah, like, I mean, like if you offered people like cash incentives or something to do that, I wouldn't have that much of a problem with it.
Well, I don't know. It's
just like it's the initiation of force, banning weapons, prohibiting people from owning particular kinds of weapons that don't entail property damage with 100% probability.
Well, I mean, like,
that's what I have a real problem with.
Me as a whole, I'm totally for the right to bear arms. Like, I'm like batshit crazy. Like, I wanted an M60 machine gun, like the one, not like the modern day ones, but like the ones from Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely. I'm totally in favor of the right to bear arms.
So, but I don't think I won't get those now, since I won't have the training on how to shoot them and clean them, because because like I told you, I have health issues, and I was actually going to go to the Marine Corps after high school, but my heart, the problem with my heart, my aorta is probably keeping me out. So yeah, that's not happening. But yeah, like, but nevertheless, if you want to own that type of gun, I don't see why not. Because like, if you look at the cities with the strictest gun laws, they have the highest crimes, and people just go ahead and get guns anyway. And you mentioned the black market, and that literally shuts down their whole argument because all the criminals are going to just be like, so what? I'll just go to the black market. If I can't go buy a gun at a gun store anymore, I'll just go to the black market. No problem. I'll just go get one. And you take that one away from me, I'll just go back there and get another. That's how it works in Chicago. Like they interviewed people who are not like criminals, but they have guns that they're not supposed to have, and they're like when they're interviewing them, they said it's that easy to get one. You just like you can just go to a certain person. They didn't say where you can go get them, but they said there are certain places where you can just go get them because gun laws are strict in that place where you can just go like to the black market and just pick one up.
Right.
So yeah, so when you have stricter gun laws, you're not stopping gun violence. You're just making it worse. And I just hate it how some people say, well, look at Japan, look at China. And I'm like, yeah, they may have strict gun laws. They may not have mass shootings like we do, but they have mass stabbings and mass incidents where I remember one incident where a guy in Japan was literally just driving his truck around running people over.
Yeah.
So like, there you go. And they always like to add up the suicide in America, but never add it up to the other countries. Cause like America doesn't have the highest suicide rate in the world, but like, it seems like when they add like all the gun violence, they add suicides as well, which is kind of stupid because back to Japan and China, they have higher suicide rates than we do. Eastern Europe has higher suicide rates than we do. And you can also look at countries like Honduras, where they have no guns allowed whatsoever, yet you have all these MS-13 gangs and stuff like that, which I know originally was in El Salvador, but like all the gang violence in Central America, they have strict gun laws there too. It seems like, and you can also look at that in Europe. The Swiss only seem to be the only Europeans who get it. The Swiss.
So, well, right now on Twitter, I'm right now in the spat with Nightmare Fuel, who call me subhuman, and I said I'm black and considered to be a super predator by a 90s Democrat.
90s Democrat? What does that mean? Like a Bill Clinton Democrat?
Hillary Clinton.
What? So I guess I'm an 80s Republican?
Well, you like Reagan, so.
Well, I do, but I also like Calvin Coolidge.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So he called me subhuman. Yay, I'm subhuman.
I would let that go, honestly. I mean, like, it's only going to distract you from more productive things, I feel like.
Nah, wait. Also, well, I just type in a tweet and basically told him that you're not everything that you thought you were. So I regret.
Yeah, well, I just wouldn't bother with him anymore, honestly.
Well, like for me, from my point of view, it's like people intend to act different on the internet than they do in reality, whereas me, I kind of don't. It's kind of like, yeah, you come at me, I'm gonna come at you back. That's just how I am. That's just like my mindset. I know that's probably not very healthy, but like I don't know, maybe I should try to do something about it.
There's certainly, I mean, there's things to be made for standing your ground, but like, you know, you need to. There's also a point where ultimately it's just really about, you know, is there a possibility that this would just stop if I dropped it now? Or, you know,
Well, point.
Would it not be worth it just to drop it entirely and move forward?
I don't know. I guess it's a bad gene thing. I mean, it's not about being offended or anything. I could care less about being offended. It's just about like, you know, getting poked and just poking back. That's just kind of like my mindset. I mean, my dad says I get it from my mom because like she's like one of those people, you know. It's like you come at her, she's gonna come at you back, and like it's like don't bother coming, and it's like don't bother coming at her because she won't give up. It's like coming at me because I won't give up. I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna waste my time like every single day. Like even if I feel like I'm gonna get back at you, I'll just wait when I got the time to do it. Like I'm not like these leftists who just like spend every moment of the day just doing that.
I'm gonna end the broadcast here. Oh, I hope everybody enjoyed themselves. Everybody enjoyed the stream, and I certainly enjoyed it. Learned a lot of things, and shout yourselves out.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at GeoLibGeorge. Yeah, I'm happy to entertain any thoughts later on based on this stream.
Soldier7, you can find me at Soldier7. Although I don't do political videos, you can find all my political videos at Right Wing Federation.
Bye.